So, very good morning to you all. Um, the fiscal policy would be our main topic of discussion in this meeting. And I remember that last week we had some very very easy start of this topic, but I would like to go again as a small, quick recap. Um, if you notice the monetary policy, you must have noticed that over there, the rail, the not the rail, the role of the state is not, the role of the politicians is not very pervasive. On the contrary, it was more managed by the professionals, people who are, they are very big names in the field of finance. They are the one who are running this monetary policy show. Um, it's more like a bureaucratic thing, not of a political phenomenon. But on the contrary, fiscal policy is highly political organ in which the state is very active and the state uses different tools and mechanisms to get into the economic affairs. So the state wants to affect the economic activities in a very pre-designed and in a very premeditated way. The state has certain objectives which it wants to fulfill through the fiscal policy. And when I say objective, they are primarily socio-economic and somewhat political objective, which the state wants to achieve by tweaking, by experimenting with the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is a set of is more like a, how to say it, it's more like a battery of different components. And the first component is the government spendings, which could essentially be the developmental and the non-developmental expenditure. So when the government want to spend something, for example, on roads, on making education infrastructure, health, housing, public facilities, all these things which we use as a public good, not as a private thing, but as a public infrastructure. We also call it public good as well, because that is a good which belongs to the entire public equally. So the government spending, we see in Uvascula, you can see that we have this HIPPOS project being run for many years. This is a classic example of fiscal policy where the state is spending to create certain infrastructure, because the objective of the state is to create Uvascula as a health city, basically. So they are on a priority basis, they are, investing or spending money in the projects which are directly or indirectly concerned with the health. It could be developmental and the non-developmental. I think I mentioned last week as well that the developmental expenditures are those when you are creating a new infrastructure. For example, you make a flyover, it's a developmental expenditure, but if you have some money to invest on a flyover, but you're not creating the flyover, you're not making a new one, but you're only spending the money to maintain it and also pay the salaries of the staff. Okay, so I'm not against paying salaries of staff, but many times the government expenditure is accused or criticized by the economist that, hey, this is just to create the jobs of some people, but basically there's no real creation of any physical assets. So there's no real social capital which is created by these projects, and they're only meant to give employment to some people. And especially in the developing countries, this problem is very rampant. I remember one Asian development project which was conducted, and they found out that in many South Asian countries, the total government spending, about 70% is spent on the non-developmental expenditure, which basically is not creating anything new, just to carry on what we have, which is very expensive. Okay. So the government spending is very important because the government spending is also very important in the sense that it creates economic activity because after all, when the government spends, um, that money goes to the companies, the individuals in the society, in the economy, and then those companies, their income increases, they employ people, they give salaries, and thus there is a multiplier effect, there is a positive externality in the society. Uh, yeah, if I miss any point, you can remember it and you can get back and bring to my attention later on. The second aspect of the fiscal policy is the taxation. Taxation, we discussed that it's a compulsory payment. It's non-voluntary contribution by the individuals and the corporates and the organization toward the state's exchequer. And with that contribution, the state exchequer or the treasury gets the resources which it can spend to finance even the government spending. So, for example, if the state wants to build up a hospital which would be very expensive, then where would the money come from? Well, one form is taxation, because taxation generates revenue. Taxation is a cash inflow for the state, whereas the government spending is the cash outflow of the state. So you can't have the cash outflow unless you have the cash inflow. So taxation is a very big contributing factor to the state's revenue. It can be the direct and the indirect taxation. Direct taxation is the one which is intended on somebody or some company X, and the company X pays it, and it cannot shift the burden of tax to the other people. Like, so the tax is intended on SHAB, and SHAB pays the tax, and SHAB cannot shift this tax on Seher, if I say so. So it means that there is no real shiftability element. So the element of shiftability is missing in case of direct taxation. I can give you example of the corporate tax. If you look at the financial statement of the company, which I would show you many times in the next course, you will find that the companies pay the income tax or the corporate tax at the end of the year, which is basically when they have the total revenue minus total cost, then they have the profit, and then they pay tax on the profit. This is called a direct tax. Individuals pay the income tax. When I get my salary, it's already deducted after tax, and then I get the net amount. So I can't shift my tax to somebody else. I have to pay it. In the same way, if I find some more example of the direct tax, I would say that we have the gift tax as well. You know, when you gift somebody, in many countries, you pay the tax. Similarly, we have the inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is when you get the property or the wealth from your predecessors, or when you are transferring your wealth, your assets, your property to the next generation. So when there is a legalized transfer of the property, that is called the inheritance, and you pay a tax on it. And there is a tax on the death also. There's a death tax also, because see, even death is not free of cost. There is a tax imposed when people die because you use the burial place and all that stuff. So that is also one of the tax. But more prominently, the direct taxes are, which we see more in business, are the income tax, which is paid by the individuals. We call it personal tax or the personal income tax, and the income tax paid by the companies, which is called the corporate tax. So these are the very strong, biggest components of the direct taxes. But at the same time, we have the indirect taxes. Indirect. Here, what happens? There is an element of shiftability. So the tax is imposed on X, but the X can transfer the tax to Y. For example, the GST is an example of the indirect tax, because the tax is imposed on the amount of the goods and services a company sells. Okay, but what the customers are suffering, or what the company is doing, that they are adding this tax to the retail price, and they are charging either fully or partially the tax from the customer. Okay, so if you are a wholesaler, if you are a factory, you produce goods, you charge a certain amount of sales tax from the retail store, and then the retail store people, they sell the goods to the final consumers, and then they are charging, they are recovering this, or they're getting compensated by the customers, fully or partially. So there is a transferability of the tax, or the shiftability of the tax. Another example of indirect tax comes to my mind is the excise duty. Excise is tax on the production. When you produce something, you pay the tax. Sales tax, as the name says, it is paid on the amount of sales. You sell something and you pay tax. On the contrary, the excise duty is something when you produce, you pay tax. But in both cases, you can shift the tax to the next tier, next entity which comes. For example, as I said, that the company can, when you make the factory production, you charge it from the wholesaler, the distributor, and then the distributors can, when the Toyota makes the cars, they pay excise duty, but they can recover from the distributors all over the world. Then the distributors can recover it from those people who run these showrooms in each city. And this showroom where these cars are displayed, these retail shops, they can recover it from the customer. So there is a chain of, there's a chain which you use to recover the tax from the next tier, the next layer. Another tax which comes to my mind is the excise duty. You can, when you buy something from abroad and you have to pay, and you have, your goods are coming and they are actually lying in the seaport, and you go and you pay the custom duty, or what do you call it? Yeah, the custom duty or the import duty. You pay it and you get your shipment. So these are the indirect forms of taxes. I continue to the public borrowings. Then public borrowing is another way of cash inflow of the state, in which the state borrows from the people or the companies. How does the state borrow? Do they go home to home? No, it doesn't work like this. The state issues certain certificates, some documents, which has a face value, for example, let's say 100 euros, and which bears the rate of interest, let's say 2%, 3%, whatever. And when people buy these documents and they pay for it, so basically the money is going to the state, and that piece of paper is with the people and the companies. And after a certain time period, the state pays the rate of interest. Normally it's paid after every 6 months, okay? And then after the period of that debt, that transaction is over, you can sell, you can give back that document to the state, and the state will pay you the amount it borrowed from you. And this is called, very simple, public borrowing. So it's not a borrowing from a particular, look, it's not called private borrowing. If it is a private borrowing, if I ask my friend, hey, can I borrow something from you? Then this is a private borrowing, because I'm a private entity and my friend is a private entity as well. So it's a private borrowing. In the public borrowing, it's a state who borrows, and it borrows from the larger audience, not from particular person. The public borrowing is very important because imagine if the government speed up its activities of spending, then it needs more money to finance. So the money can come from taxation or the public borrowings. But remember, in taxation, there is no return. Of course, with the taxation, you create facilities, but there is no, you don't have to pay it back. It never happened that you pay taxes back. Well, you can pay actually, because if you are getting taxes from a company and the company is in loss, then you need to refund some other taxes as well. The public borrowing, as I said, that the state is borrowing from the individuals and the body corporates, the organizations. Almost every organization pays the tax. But in the public borrowing, it's the amount which is borrowed because it's a word. The key word is borrowing. It means sooner or later, this finances has to be returned to the lender, and lender in this case is the public. Basically, public includes individuals and the institutions. Okay. The institutions can be for-profit institutions like companies, or they can be non-profit institutions like universities or schools, and likewise. Public borrowing can be internal and external. If you are borrowing within the country, if you are borrowing from people within your own country, let's say the Ministry of Finance in Finland is issuing some certificates according to which the people who are living in Finland, they can buy them. Buy means when they purchase those documents, they are giving money back to the state. So this is a borrowing, but it's within the country, remember. But the public borrowing can go beyond the geographical boundaries as well. As you can see that it can be external borrowing as well. In other words, the state of Finland can issue the bonds which are also bought by people and the companies in Britain or in Denmark or in other countries. There are many countries who have their bonds, the state bonds, they're issuing in many global companies. We call them Euro bonds or the global bonds. So they are workable. Similarly, the borrowing can be bilateral or multilateral. The bilateral is when the borrowing arrangement is between two, like state is borrowing, let's say, from an institution, a particular institution. Look at the word bilateral, which means by two parties involved. One is a borrower and the second is a lender. Okay, so it's an arrangement between the two. But this organization is also a public organization. But in case of multilateral organization, for example, if the state of Finland is borrowing from IMF or World Bank, okay, then this is a multilateral borrowing because the World Bank or IMF do not belong to a particular country. It's a multi-organization. It's a multinational organization in that way, that it's a multilateral organization. It's not one. For example, if state of Finland is borrowing from state of Denmark, it's between two countries. Okay. Why it's not a private borrowing? Because both states are public organizations, because state cannot be a private entity. So one public organization is borrowing from another public organization, but one-to-one. Whereas if you are borrowing from a global organization, like World Bank, IMF, International Financial Corporation, for example, ECB, the European Central Bank, then it becomes a multilateral borrowing. Okay, and very quickly, The last point is called deficit financing or the surplus finance. Deficit financing is that if a country has its expenditure equals to 100, okay, let me cook up an example. Let me create some example. I think then it'll be better for you to understand what I'm trying to say. Let's say state expenses are equal to 100. Taxation in the country or the state, let's say 40, maybe 50. Let's not be so miser. All taxes, both direct and indirect taxation. And then the borrowings. Bring borrowings again, internal, external, bilateral, multilateral, are equal to 40. So it means that 50 plus 40 are equal to 90. So the total cash inflow, you can say, is equal to 90. But the state's expenses or the cash outflow is 100. It means what would you call when your expenses exceed your income? I think then we use the word deficit. There is a deficit of there's a deficit of 10 euros. And let's say there is no other mean, but these 10 euros are recovered by issuing money supply in the economy. In which, now see, now you can ask me that money supply is the monetary policy thing. This is where the fiscal policy comes in interaction with the monetary policy, that the state needs 10 more euros to balance its budget or balance its the economy. And then if there is no other way, there's no possibility to increase taxes, there's no possibility to borrow more. Okay, in that case, the state can ask the central bank of the country, could you please issue 10 euros more? And if that is the case, that the state's finances are run by the printing of more money supply, then we use a phrase called deficit financing. It's a very, very dangerous tool. It's okay as an exception, but if you make it a rule, then this can be extremely inflationary, and it can bring down the value of the domestic local currency so low that can have very serious repercussions on the country's economy. Okay, so deficit financing is a tool, but it's a kind of last resort, but it's at the same time it's like a time bomb. It's like it's ticking away, tick, 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 and at some stage it can blast. So if you keep borrowing, if you keep using this deficit financing as not as an exception, not as an emergency measure, but you keep using, the state keep using it constantly, then it can be an economic suicide by the country if it goes on. If you see all the big example of the economic fiasco over the world in South America, if you see the many countries which almost got bankrupted because their value of the currency was so low, it went down, like Venezuela and these Colombia and Peru. There's so many examples Similarly, if you see in Africa, Zimbabwe is a classic example where the inflation rate has been of over 100% on a daily basis, and it is because the value of the money is basically getting nothing. It's just like it has no value. So this is called deficit financing. But on the contrary, if I slightly revise the figures, imagine that the states can raise 70 euros as tax, not 50. So in that case, 70 plus 40 would be 110. So in this example, if this extra 10, which is because now this is the revenue and this is the expenses, we can also have the surplus financing. Surplus financing. It means that there is a surplus in the state's revenue. State's revenue is more than the expenditure, so this is a good situation. Well, it has its own side effects, but I will not discuss it now. But yes, the countries often have the deficit financing or the surplus financing. Deficit financing, as I said, that it can be very dangerous. So if you are the public policy or some economic planner, or even if you are doing this thing at the corporate level, you should be very careful when you are doing this deficit. Well, of course, you can't print more money as a company, but if your revenue is below your total expenses, and you keep borrowing or you keep asking the so in case of private companies, this borrowing should be used very carefully. But if you are a public entity, the only one public entity which has a right to print more money is the state. Okay, so the state has to be very, very cautious. If it makes it routine, it should be used as an exception. All right, so no. Stop sharing. Okay. So, sorry. So, to answer the previous question, I would quickly recall that in the real life, the monetary and fiscal policy do not work in isolation. They work together. So, for example, if the state gets this kind of information, or if the central bank of the country informs the Ministry of Finance, you know what, we have a lot of money as a surplus money or excess of money supply. And because of excess of money supply, there can be inflation in the economy. And when there's inflation, the value of the money can go down. This can kill our exports. What should we do? Well, let's take this money out. It's like you are using the Hoover to take the extra money out. What do you call as a vacuum cleaner? Yeah. So let's clean this extra money from the economy, from the system. Okay, what will you do? And this is the meeting between so-called fiscal people and the monetary people, the Ministry of Finance and the central bank of the country. And then the ministry says, okay, let's issue some bonds. But would you please use your banking system to take this money away? Okay, why not? Let's do it. So this is how the monetary and the fiscal policy, they work in tandem together. And as I said before, that their objectives are pretty much in line with one another. Okay, and most of the three core objectives, which I can say for sure, is that, or rather four objectives. One is that both wants to generate more employment. Both means monetary and fiscal policy. Both wants to check inflation. Both wants to have economic growth. And above all, the point which I missed out, both want to have economic stability. So employment generation, inflation in check, economic growth increase, and economic stability maintenance are the four core objectives of both monetary and fiscal policy. Just to let you know that John Maynard Keynes, J.M. Keynes, is a very famous macroeconomist. He is the one who gave the idea of the fiscal policy. His rationale of, and he was basically Queen's advisor at that time, J.M. Keynes. And I think his book is published in 1936. It's called General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And I have been fortunate that I have the PDF of this book. And this is a masterpiece book, I would say. And his idea was that, if I can put his idea, that in the free market economy, there are players. Now, if the players are playing the football match and there is no rules and regulation, there's a danger of the injuries. So therefore, somebody has to make the rules and regulations about how to play football, how to play in a sportsmanship with the spirit, and who is the person who will be taking care that the rules are followed properly. It's a referee. So Keynes says that the state is the referee in the state, in the economic affairs. And then he goes beyond this and he says that, hey, the state can be referee and the state can also be a player as well. So if you see taxation, if you look at all these instruments which I mentioned in the first paragraph, you will find that the state is acting as a player. By player means they have their own mission. They want to score a goal. And the state want to score the goal by increasing or decreasing the economic activity through government spending, through changing taxation, by increasing or decreasing the public borrowings, or by using deficit financing. So these are the measures which the state is taking to fulfill its own agenda. It means, according to Keynes, state is not just a referee of the match, but state can also act as an active player, which has its own mission and its own vision. So the state is an active player, whereas in the monetary policy, the state is not very actively involved in the economic affairs as such. Fiscal policy. You can see in the last paragraph, as I wrote, that the fiscal policy became extremely popular as a troubleshooter in the Great Depression. So if you see the Great Depression of 1930s, when the Europe and the many other parts of the world were, the factories were being shut, the employment was decreasing, or people were getting mass scale unemployment. The prices were going down, which is a good sign, but at the same time, people were not having jobs even to pay the minimum price. So that is the situation. And as Shiny asked that, how does the recession happens? Well, the recession happens when there is a lack of demand and there is excess of supply. So whenever there's more production, and in comparison to the production, there's a lack of demand. And why do people demand? People demand for three purposes. Consumption. You want to consume something. Why do I demand? Why do I go to a store? Because I want to consume something. So when I consume something, I buy a grocery stuff. I pay cash, okay? I pay money with cash or with credit card, doesn't matter. But so the economic activity is going on. The second reason I want to demand more is the investment purpose. So I want to invest. I want to buy stocks. I want to start a new shop. I want to have a new project, Or I have my new existing business, but I want to increase more machinery into it, employ more people into it, spend on R&D, buy more better technology. So this is the investment purpose. And the third reason the demand is made by the government, because don't forget, the government is a very big buyer. The government want to start a hospital, it needs labor, people get job. It need to buy those construction material. Those suppliers get more revenue. Okay, and the hospital needs some machinery. Okay, then those companies which produce machinery, they get more money. So this way, there is a cycle. So the three components of demand: consumption, investment, and the government expenditure. So the three components are consumption, which leads to more demand. If people want to consume more, there'll be more demand in the economy. If people have less income, less willingness to buy, less resources to buy, then the consumption would be less. Investment. If there is a recovery in the economy, if the future is very bright, you invest. If the future is bleak, pessimistic, you invest less. If the government want to expand more activities because the government think that the economy is growing fast, we need to have more hospitals, more schools, more educational institutions, more resources to create new roads, new infrastructure, new research and development. Then they spend more money on it. Okay, and that is the demand, the total demand in the economy. But the problem is that if this demand start falling, okay, then if there's no demand, there's no supply. And as a result, the factories don't have to produce more goods because there's less of demand. And if there is a less of demand and factories don't stop, they don't have the need to produce more, they don't place any order to suppliers. So the suppliers' income goes down. They don't need to have more workforce, so they can sack many people, so people get no job. And if this cycle goes on, if it happens in one company, in the second company, in the third company, look, if there's a less demand for computers, people who work in the computer industry will have less jobs. But then the computers are assembled by many components, for example, the semiconductors. If there's a lack of demand for computers, there will be lack of demand for semiconductors as well. Hence, the employment of semiconductor companies will also go down. And people who produce semiconductors, they need some very special micro electronic equipment. And those people who are making those chips or those small tiny mini parts, they will also have less demand. And as a result, what happened? There is a knock-on impact. There is a cycle of downfall in the economy. Because remember, we all are mutual buyers of each other's activity. Okay, so we are not only producers or consumers, we are both. So that way, when there is an excess of supply over demand, or if I put it the other way around, when there is a shortage of demand over the supply in comparison to supply, then the recession starts. Okay, and when I say demand include three things. Actually, demand include four things, but the three visible things are consumption, investment, and the government expenditure. Okay, so if these three things, now imagine if state, if we have a new government in the country which is very outdated, they don't have any economic vision, then they might not spend money on new hospitals. They might not spend money on the education because they have no economic vision. They might not produce R&D labs for the factories, for the companies. And as a result of less education, less health, people's productivity will go down. Because of lack of research and development, the quality of the products and services which the companies produce will go down. And what will happen then? Lack of demand. And as a result, there would be recession. The visible signs of recession are there's a mass scale unemployment. Um, Factories are not working because there's no need. And there is a very, what is the word, pessimistic atmosphere in the economy. That is the recession. And this is what was recovered by fiscal policy, played a big role. If you remember, I used the word 1936 when this book by Lord Keynes, he was given lordship by the Queen, Lord Keynes or G.M. Keynes. It was published, this General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and try to understand the background of the book. 1930s was the decade when the Europe, UK, and the rest of the world was suffering from this recession, which means less demand than supply. At that time, the monetary policy was not so successful because monetary policy is like a laid back attitude. They stay back a little bit out of the direct economic activity. Here, the example which I gave you, that the state not only has to be the referee in the football match, but it also has to be a player sometimes. So here in the fiscal policy, the state was not just making the rules, but state also came as a spender of, so that the economic activities could be ignited, could be started. I remember a sentence which was used in the book. It says, if you want to cure the recession, then dig up the holes and then fill it. So there is a very famous line in the book used. It's so good that I really want to write it down. It says, where is the text? Yeah. Dig up the holes and fill it. The idea is that during that time, the recession is so much that no private company wants to invest. And the idea is that even the state should go to this extreme, that to start the recovery cycle in the economy, the state should ask people, hey, I employ you, come at the work. And your job is that come in the morning, dig up the holes, and then afternoon, just fill the holes. What will happen with this? When you call people in the morning, you tell them to dig up the holes, and then in the afternoon, you say, fill the holes. You give them some wage. And with this wage, people buy food. When people buy food, the income of food stores increases. They give more jobs. They place more order for food to the suppliers. And the suppliers' income, sorry for my spelling, then suppliers' revenue and employment also increases. And then it leads to economic recovery. And this is made only possible because state is proactive. Because when there is an economic downfall, there is a recession, state cannot be reactive. State has to come forward, come out of its comfort zone, and take the problem head on and find some solution rather than waiting and crying and groaning and moaning. So the state has to be very active in the economic affairs. So this is why the fiscal policy is so important, especially in the developing countries. I can imagine for the developed countries, their economic path is set. It's more automatic. It's more on the autopilot, even though it's not any longer valid. It used to be, but not anymore. But for the developing countries, having the fiscal policy, the developing countries can never, never, never grow purely based on the monetary policy. The monetary policy has to come as a secondary support, second fiddle to the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has to lead the economic affairs, and the monetary policy has to supplement or complement the fiscal policy. So if you are in a developing country, emerging country, then the role of the state in the economic affairs is very, very important. By the way, even in the so-called capitalist countries, the role of state is very important. Look at Finland, look at the Scandinavia, the state is super active in many socio-economic affairs. Even in the USA, which is the epitome of the capitalism, I would say, if I'm not wrong, about 20% of the GDP or even more is coming from the state activities. So the state is super active in the economic affairs. And this is the way it should be. Otherwise, why there is state? If the state is not actively participating in the economic affairs, in the social affairs, then the question is, why do the state exist? Yeah. So the fiscal policy, in many cases, I use these italics to emphasize that it's a troubleshooter if you want to get rid of the recession, or as it happened in the Great Depression. This is where the John Maynard Keynes came so in the limelight. Fiscal policy is the opposite to the classical, because if you look at the classical economist, they say, hey, it should be all the economic activities be done by the invisible hand. The invisible hand is not always present. Demand curve, supply curve, price, let's call it P. Have you seen this picture before?
Yes.
Okay. This is the equilibrium, yeah?
Yes.
If it happens, the equilibrium price is P. If it happens that the price is above the equilibrium price, the price should be P, but the price is P1. When the price is above the equilibrium, look at the supply and look at the demand. Who is more? At P1 price, is supply more or demand more? At the price OP1, the original, okay, O, yeah. At the price OP1, is supply more or demand more?
Supply more.
Supply more. What happens when supply is more and demand is less? What happens to price? When supply of something is more than demand, what happens to the price?
It goes down.
It goes down. Did somebody pull this price down, or is it happening because of the demand and supply mechanism? This happens automatically, that whenever there is a disturbance, then the price will automatically return to where it should be. Similarly, if because of some disturbance, price is below The price should be OP, but the price is OP2. And at the price OP2, the demand is this much, but supply is this much. Hence, demand is more, supply is less. What happens when demand is more and supply is less?
Price go up.
Price goes up. Did I have to call somebody to push the price up? Or is it happening in the market automatically?
It's happening automatically.
This is called the price mechanism, which is like an invisible hand. A hand is there to make these changes, but that hand is invisible. If it was done by the state, then it would have been a visible hand, because the state is so visible. But if it is happening in the market automatically, then it's called invisible hand. So the whole market, the price mechanism or the market mechanism around which the entire course is based, all this course that we're studying, economics, is based about, is moving around this diagram, this picture, the price mechanism or the market mechanism. And the price mechanism or the market mechanism is based on the invisible hand. This, if there's a disturbance, if there's a disequilibrium, it will be automatically fixed. Okay. When the price is more than the equilibrium price, then there is a what's the word? Then we say there is a excess demand. So excess supply, excess demand, or demand shortage. Okay, you can say excess supply. Excess supply or demand shortage.
Sharp, the state is therefore control the minimum and the maximum price, right? The rate?
Yeah. That's where the state can jump in there. Because if you don't stop the price rising beyond a level, then you're hurting your consumers. And if you don't let the price fall below, if price keep rising, your consumers would be devastated. And in the same way, if the price is falling, then you are hurting your producers, farmers, producers, all these people. So you have to make a fair balance between them. And if the price is too low, then then we say that there is a excess demand, supply shortage. So these things are, the classical economists say that these things are done, these corrections are done by the invisible hand. But believe me, this invisible hand was missing during the First World War, during the Second World War, and afterwards. So this invisible hand work during the good times, but when there is an economic or political or social problem, then the state has to come forward more actively and take care of the economic matters. So the invisible hand can be invisible forever when there is a problem. So you let the invisible hand be active in the state, in the economic matters in the normal times, but the state must be ready to come in the picture like the paratroopers whenever the need be. Okay, so we go on. During the recession, the government employed the expansionary fiscal policy. Shiny, this is again, you may find it relevant. During the recession, if you want to remove the recession, The government should come forward and be more expansionary. Expansionary means lower the taxes so that the economic activities start. When the tax is lowered, then people would consume more, they would buy more, they would invest more. The state should increase the spendings, just create the economic activities so that people can get jobs. Remember the example, dig up the holes and fill it, that kind of thing. Or even if the need be, print more money supply, okay, which is not very advisable in the normal time, but in the extreme cases you can. Similarly, if there is an inflation, inflation means there is an excess of demand over supply. There's too much of money supply. People are getting jobs, but the price is so high that the people's living standards are going down. In that case, you need to employ the contractionary fiscal policy, increase taxes. So you take away, when you increase more taxes, you basically are taking away the money back from the people and from the public. Decrease the spendings and try to save money. What is a word called? Austerity. Save money. Okay. So if you want to get rid of recession, you mean the state needs to be more expansionary, more flamboyant, spend more, decrease taxes, even borrow more, and so that you can invest it. And if there is a already inflation in the economy, then you need to be more cautious, more what is the word? More conservative. You need to increase the taxes, you need to decrease the spendings and the borrowings and so on and so forth. Whether you follow expansionary or the contractionary policy, they have their own merits and demerits. Okay, if you're getting too much expansionary policy, then it can lead to inflation, and if you are following too much of the contractionary policy, then it can lead to recession, which both are bad. Normally, I say that inflation is bad because it leads to price increase. But the good thing of inflation is that people can still manage to get jobs. For the recession, the good thing is that the prices are down, but the bad thing is that people don't have jobs. It means for the inflation, the bad thing is that there is a increase in the price, the living standards can go down. And the bad thing about the recession is that people don't have jobs. And sometimes we have the bad things of both. And that is called stagflation. Like there's a saying that you have the best of both worlds, but sometimes you can have the worst of both worlds. The worst of inflation is increase in the price, which is inflation. And the worst of recession is the unemployment. So you can have a situation when the prices are increasing and people don't have jobs at the same time. And that is called stagflation. And this can happen quite often. And I'll discuss it with you, with how the inflation and the recession can come together and cause stagflation. So stagflation is a situation when you have the good thing of inflation is people have job, so there is employment. The good thing of recession is that the prices are low. So can we have very utopian, very idealistic scenario where have people have jobs and the prices are also low? I wish if it were true. But we can have the bad situation when we have the worst of both. So when we have simultaneous existence of inflation and recession. And if it happens, it's called stagflation. Okay. And I will show it to you. Um, Look at the first picture at this left-hand side where the cursor is moving. We take the national GDP, the national output here, and we take the price level here. Be very attentive to this picture. This is supply curve, we know it's upward sloping, and this is a demand curve. It's AD1, so it's the first demand curve, the blue one. When the blue demand curve existed, the AD1, and supply curve is AS. Equilibrium was at this point. This was the country's GDP, and this was the price level, OP1. It means that the average price in the economy was OP1, and the overall GDP, income, output, and employment was OQ1. And then there is the demand curve goes up, means there's more demand. And you can see that the demand curve jumps from blue to red, means it goes up. Now the new equilibrium is this point. Even though the price has increased to OP2, so there is inflation. Okay, so there is inflation, yeah? But the good news is that people have more jobs as well, because the GDP of the country has gone up. I call it good inflation, or it's called demand pull inflation, because the inflation is happening because of more demand. Demand goes up, and as a result, the price increases. But the good thing is that even though price has increased, people have more jobs. Do you get it? But this is the bad inflation on the right side. This is the bad inflation. And this is called, this inflation doesn't happen because the demand has gone up. This inflation happens because the cost of production has gone up. You know, the raw material has become expensive. Rent has become expensive. You pay more rent. The interest rate has gone up. So all the components which, or tax has increased, by the way. All those things which push your cost up is called cost push inflation. And I call it bad inflation, and you can also call it stagflation. Let's see what happens. AD is the demand curve, original. AS is a supply curve, AS1, the original supply curve. Equilibrium is here. The average price in the economy is OP1, and the employment is OQ1. Now, be careful. The cost in the economy has gone up. Rent increased by 5%. Interest goes up from 1 to 3%, which is a cost. If you are a business person, interest is a cost to you. Rent has gone up. Wages have gone up. By the way, the wage level have gone up. As a result, your cost has gone up. So produce the same amount of goods, you need to push the cost up. And when the cost goes up, your supply curve basically goes up. So your supply curve is pushed up. Supply curve is like a cost curve, basically. So because the cost goes up, therefore the supply curve goes up. It means earlier to produce OQ1 or OQ2, your cost was this much, but now the cost has gone up. So you put the supply curve upward. And as a result, what happens? The equilibrium is here. And when there's this new equilibrium, what happens? The price increases. Well, the price increased last time also, but the difference is that now when the price increases, there is unemployment. Here, when the price went up, the employment increased. Here, when the price went up from P1 to P2, P1 to P2, the employment fell from Q1 to Q2. This is very dangerous. This could be the worst situation for any economy in the world. That on the one hand, there is inflation. Well, okay, we can have some consolation if the inflation is accompanied by increase in the output or employment. If the price goes up, you can frown, but you can also see, hey, people are getting more jobs. But here, see what happens. The price went up, but the output employment goes down. This is the, if I have to draw one picture which depicts the doomsday, the downfall, the biggest challenge, the biggest threat, the possible economic failure of a country, then this is the picture. This is the picture I want to draw the least, because it shows the absolute disastrous situation for the economy. The price is increasing, there is inflation, but the employment is also falling. So people are not only paying more money to buy the food and the basic things, but they're also losing jobs. This is called bad inflation, or the cost push inflation, or we call it stagflation. The good inflation is this one. At least it leads to more employment. So when the prices increases because of more demand, it's good. But if the prices are increasing because the cost is increasing, not the demand is increasing. Demand is from the consumption side and the cost is from the production side. When the cost is increasing, so it means the problem is from the production side. And because of more cost, the price which you want to recover from your customers, you push the price up. That is the dangerous situation. Okay, so we have a choice here between the demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. So, well, it's not a choice. Sometimes there's no, you have to compete. So this is the two situations of inflation. So very quickly, if you have any questions, please ask me about these things.